Hello YouTube. The most common question I receive from people is for my views on animals and veganism. I've had many people ask me in comments, I've had emails about it, so I decided to just do a video about it where I will summarise my views, and then I guess if anyone asks me in the future I can just point them to this. Okay then, so a bit of background. First, I'm a moral anti-realist. In my view, morality is something that is constructed by humans. Moral rules are useful fictions. There are no moral facts. Now, I do think that a moral realist could agree with a lot of what I'm going to say here, but, I just want to put my cards on the table. I see morality as something that we invent, not something that we discover. Now, simplifying things quite significantly, my view is that there are, broadly speaking, two ways in which we construct moral systems. There's emotion on the one hand, and then there's working out rules to promote self-interest on the other. So, emotion. Emotion clearly plays a significant role in our moral judgments. Many moral judgments are grounded in brute emotional reactions. For example, some people experience disgust at the idea of homosexuality or incest, which drives the judgments that these activities are morally wrong. Or some people will experience anger at hearing others express racist views, or maybe anger at hearing somebody question an authority figure, or sympathy when seeing people in poverty, or indeed sympathy when seeing animals in distress, anger seeing people inflict suffering on animals. If you want to tell a broader story here, I guess you can go into how our biology and our culture influence our emotional reactions, but that's kind of irrelevant for our purposes. So, the emotions play an important role in motivating us, but there's not much scope for argument here. I suppose we all want our emotional reactions to have a degree of coherence. We might well question, for instance, whether it is reasonable to have sympathy for poverty in one's own country while feeling less sympathy for poverty in other countries. We might question whether that's sort of a reasonable set of reactions to have. But at the end of the day, people will just have different emotional reactions, and emotions just sort of happen to us. So what if I don't share your emotions? With respect to animal suffering, this may be the case, because animal suffering doesn't move me emotionally at all. But the second significant aspect of moral thinking is the construction of rules designed to promote long-run self-interest. Consider, for instance, property conventions. We divide the world up so that particular items are designated as belonging to particular people. Now, we may question the specific details of our current property conventions, but it's hard to see how to organise a complex society without property conventions of some kind. So there's a clear way in which having a system of property conventions is in my self-interest, and indeed in the self-interest of pretty much everyone else, even though it imposes constraints on my behaviour. The best option for me, the best kind of scenario would be if I can just take whatever I want from others, while others observe constraints on their behaviour. Right, that way I could accumulate whatever resources I want and nobody would be able to take the things that I like from me. But the problem, obviously, is that if everybody reasoned in this way, then nobody would observe any constraints, and then all the things that I value would be at risk, because at any time somebody might just break into my house and take stuff. That would be a terrible situation for pretty much everybody. So the idea is, let's all agree to observe a property convention. This will specify certain things that count as my possessions. It will specify rules for gaining new possessions, and obviously there will be some sort of enforcement, some protection of my possessions. Now, this will impose limits on my behaviour, but it will make me better off by protecting me from the depredations of others. What's more, it will promote cooperation and trade and economic development. Again, this isn't to defend modern capitalist property rights or anything like that. Any complex society is going to have some sort of conventions for property ownership. And those conventions will impose constraints on my behaviour, but make me better off. Here's another example, right? I enjoy walking on the field, let's say. I like being able to walk on the field whenever I want. But I can see that if everybody walks on the field whenever they want, that will degrade the field and then it will look like shit and no one will want to walk on it. So it's in my self-interest to accept a rule that imposes limits on my behaviour. The rule might be, each person can walk on the field no more than once a week. Of course, the best rule from my point of view would be, each person uses the field only once a week, except for Kane, who can use it whenever he wants. But obviously nobody's going to accept that. They will quite reasonably demand, hey, what's so special about you? The impartial rule is the best compromise. In general then, we all agree to observe constraints upon our behaviour, because we each see that it is in our self-interest for other people to observe the same kind of constraints. Moral rules are the outcome of this kind of process. So this is I guess, the key point. Why is there a rule against mugging people? Well, it's not because mugging people is morally wrong. Rather, the idea is that it is in each individual's self-interest to have a system of property conventions where all people constrain themselves from taking other people's property. Then what makes mugging wrong is that we've negotiated on this rule. Moral beliefs, again, are the outcome of this process of rational agents working out rules to promote their own interests. So my view then is basically that moral rules are constructed by rational agents for the benefit of rational agents. And here, rationality, when I talk about rational agents, what I have in mind is capacities like long-term planning, the ability to consider sets of social rules, to compare the costs and benefits of adopting particular rules, to give reasons for and against particular actions, to impose constraints upon one's own behaviour in accordance with this reasoning. People who are capable of doing this are part of the core moral community. Now, there are no non-human animals that have this capacity. None of them have any role to play in the construction of moral rules. So at least prima facie, animals don't count. Animals don't matter. So what then is the appropriate relation between emotions and the process of rule construction? Well, I've said, there are these two sort of separate sources, and I've suggested that the emotional element should be downplayed. But you might doubt that there is, in practice, any significant distinction here. After all, if I have concern for animals, then it benefits me to know that animals are not being harmed. I experience pleasure when I see animals flourishing, and I experience negative emotions when I see animals suffering. So the thought would be, hang on, I have a self-interested reason to support a rule against harming animals. I mean, the problem with this kind of move here is that the same kind of reasoning can be used against any action you care to name. We can make the same point about homosexuality, or indeed about people eating mustard. So the homophobe will say that they experience negative emotions when they see homosexuals. So, obviously the general point is that X makes me feel bad is not enough to justify a general rule against people doing X. Indeed, thoughtful people will actually recognise that it is, in general, in our best interest to permit people to do things that we find distasteful. Why? Well, because we will also probably want to do a lot of things that other people find distasteful, that promote negative emotions in other people. So we can't accept, like, X makes me feel bad or X accepts me as grounds for any kind of rule against doing X, because all sorts of things upset people. There's no way to reach any kind of agreement on universal rules here. Also, just a brief aside, bitter experience leads me to suspect that somebody is going to respond to this. But hey, vegans don't say that it's wrong to cause animal suffering because animal suffering makes them feel bad. That's not their argument. Yeah, I know that's not their argument. I am not saying that vegans grant animals moral status on the grounds that animal suffering makes them feel bad. If you think that's my argument, go back and listen a bit more carefully. All I'm doing here is addressing a potential objection to my general approach to morality. Okay, so emotions do have an important part to play in our moral thinking. But generally my take on this is that emotions receive their justification through the practice of rule construction. In other words, just as morality is the outcome of this process, so the morally loaded emotions should also be the outcome of this process. And the important role that emotions have to play and the way that they receive their justification through this process of rule construction is that while we might recognise that it would be in all our interests for people to follow a particular rule, intellectual recognition often doesn't provide much motivation. Emotions like sympathy, compassion, guilt, shame, anger, these are powerful motivators. So let's take sympathy. Well, we certainly want to encourage sympathy in response to human suffering. If I see a person in pain and I sympathise with them, then I will feel a strong motivation to help them. And one of the rules that we probably want in our community is that if you see somebody suffering and you're able to help them, then you should do so, because it benefits all of us if we all agree to make minor sacrifices to help each other out, when we're in need. But merely coming to this conclusion through reasoning doesn't, in the moment, provide that much motivation, or at least it may not. There's no particular reason why it would do. We need to cultivate appropriate emotions so that people are actually moved to conform with the moral rules. And so that's the important role, I think, of emotions, or the proper role of emotions here. But what this means is that we can subject our emotional responses to moral critique. So disgust at homosexuality is inappropriate, because we should favour a society in which people are able to freely pursue relationships with other consenting adults. If people have cultivated disgust at homosexuality, that's going to interfere with our ability to construct that kind of society. In the same way, I think sympathy for animals can be inappropriate, because we should use animals when it benefits us to do so, even if the animal suffers as a result. Of course, there are limits to how much we can influence our own emotions, but it does seem pretty clear to me that disgust at homosexuality and sympathy for animal suffering can be dampened to a significant extent, while on the other hand, sympathy for human suffering can be promoted. We only have to look at different societies which have had different attitudes in these respects. I should say, incidentally, I don't think sympathy for animals is always inappropriate, just that it can be when it interferes with human goals. I suspect that sympathy for service animals is useful provided it's appropriately restricted. You don't want to treat a service animal completely like a person, or it will potentially lose its training, but you certainly don't want people to be mean to it. Okay then, so that is my basic perspective. As I said, I'm aware there are a lot of simplifications here, but hopefully that makes it reasonably clear why I do not treat animals as having moral standing. Now, the standard objection to any position that denies animals moral standing is the marginal cases argument. There are different ways of formalising this argument, but the basic idea, I think, is very straightforward and quite powerful. Basically, the vegan will challenge us to specify, and I say vegan, I suppose I shouldn't say vegan, I should say like animal rights defender or whatever, but I'm going to carry on saying vegan now that I've made that clear. Obviously, the animal liberationist, let's say, will challenge us to specify what's the difference between all humans and all non-human animals. What property is shared by all humans that justifies us in granting moral status to all humans while denying moral status to animals? Then, for any proposed property P that is supposed to distinguish humans and animals, the animal liberationist will argue that some humans also lack P. And so those humans will end up being denied moral standing also on this view, which is absurd. Take rationality, which I've said is key to moral standing. This isn't an unusual position. Rationality is often treated as the morally relevant distinguishing feature of humans. But if we claim that the reason why it's okay to kill animals, but not okay to kill any humans, is that humans are rational, the vegan will point out that there are many humans who aren't rational, such as infants. And then the claim will be that every other criterion that anyone has proposed to exclude animals will also exclude infants. So basically, the person who objects to animal rights, the defender of the anthropocentric position, faces a dilemma. Either it is not okay to impose suffering on animals, or it is okay to impose suffering on infants. But obviously it's not okay to impose suffering on infants, so it's not okay to impose suffering on animals. the criterion that you have used for granting moral status can't be right because it excludes certain groups of humans like infants. And any criterion that grants moral standing to all humans will also end up granting it to some animals. Now, in a sense, it's fairly simple to answer this argument, because you could just take, for instance, the property of being human, or the property of having like human DNA or something as conferring moral standing. The property of being human is obviously shared by all humans and is not shared with any animals. The problem with this move should be obvious. It's completely arbitrary. The question, after all, is what's so special about being human, right? And so just saying, well, all humans have the property of being human, that's not a very satisfying answer. Along the same lines, imagine a racist saying that only white people have moral standing. When we ask for what the relevant difference is between white people and black people, they simply point to the property of being white. Well, that's not enough. We need we need there to be not just a distinguishing property, but that distinguishing property needs to be something morally relevant. In the same way, we need a property that distinguishes all humans from all animals in a way that is morally relevant. Rationality is morally relevant, but doesn't seem to work. At least that's the argument, because there are non-rational humans. So I will explain shortly where and why I draw the lines, let's say, but before I do that, I do want to point out an important consequence of this argument, which often seems to go unstated. The marginal cases argument is not simply an argument for the view that animals should be granted rights, or that animals are worthy of moral consideration, or whatever. More exactly, it's an argument for moral equivalence, for the view that animals and marginal humans are morally equivalent. So whatever degree of moral protection we grant to infants and other marginal humans, this must also be granted to animals. And this has some quite radical consequences, because in the case of marginal humans, we generally take it that we are not just obligated to leave them alone, but also we have positive obligations to protect their welfare. We are obligated to interfere on their behalf. So let's say you're out for a walk one day and you come across an infant being eaten alive by a pack of rats. It seems like you have an obligation to step in and kick the rats away. Or if the infant is drowning and you can save it at no risk to yourself, you should do that. Or if the infant is starving and you have some spare baby food, you should give some to the infant. There's a moral obligation to intervene to save the infant's life, or at least to prevent its suffering. I mean, that's the common sense position, at least. I guess you can always question common sense positions, but that's the standard sort of view. But if you accept that, and then you accept the marginal cases argument, well, if animals are granted the same standing as infants, and if we have positive obligations to protect infants, then we also have positive obligations to protect animals. The marginal cases argument can be run quite clearly on anyone who denies this. So if somebody denies this, then you can just say, well, what is the property that's shared by all humans that justifies or requires a positive obligation to help, but that is not shared with any animals, right? Either we deny that there are positive obligations to help marginal humans, or we accept that there are positive obligations to help animals in similar situations. If we take seriously the idea that animals and infants are of equivalent moral status, then it seems we should be putting a similar sort of effort into eliminating wild animal suffering as we do into eliminating the suffering of marginal humans. We might start policing nature. We could, for instance, attempt to eliminate predators from ecosystems while using more humane methods to control prey populations. We could send out teams of people to provide medical care for sick animals, or to quickly euthanize those that would otherwise die slowly. Certainly if you ever happen to come across an animal being attacked by another, or an animal that is injured or sickly, you should provide aid. Just as we expect hospitals to provide free treatment to sick infants, so vet services should be set up to provide treatment to wild animals. And of course it would be impractical and would have a variety of terrible consequences for us to attempt to completely restructure the natural world in the image of our moral ideals. But even so, if we're saying that that animals and infants, say, are morally equivalent, then it looks like wild animals are going to make some pretty significant moral demands upon us, and we should be doing something to aid them. And there are steps that we could take to alleviate suffering in the wild. So I should note that there is a significant literature on wild animal suffering, and some philosophers have endorsed intervention in nature so as to reduce it. So some people are happy to accept this conclusion. I think it's extremely counterintuitive. When we see predation occurring among wild animals, or when we see a wild animal starving or injured, maybe we'll feel some sympathy for it. Maybe even a few people will be motivated to help it, but very few people, I predict, would take it that there's a moral obligation to help it. I find this conclusion completely outrageous, but that's just me. So I do think it's worth noting that the argument has this consequence. I think it's an unwelcome consequence, which is why I mention it here. But with that said, how do I deal with the marginal cases argument? I've said that the core moral community consists of agents with a certain type of rationality. So for me, rationality is the key distinguishing feature. Obviously, I will want to extend moral status beyond this. I grant that any view that entails that infants don't matter would be rejected as utterly absurd by most people. If you want others to accept your moral system, you do need to put some effort into conforming with their deepest moral intuitions. And there are very few things as morally repugnant to people as the idea that we might, kill infants for food or use infants in medical experiments. So we'd better come up with some sort of answer to this. I think it's actually fairly straightforward to capture infants and many other marginal humans. However, I do need to preface this by saying there are certain cases here which I can't talk about in as much detail as I would like, and this is because of YouTube's hate speech policy. Actually, this policy is much more of a problem for anybody who endorses the argument from marginal cases than it is for me, because it very clearly rules out claiming similarities between animals and particular groups of humans. So this is something the vegan community should be objecting to, because I imagine it puts a lot of your content at risk. A lot of what you are doing, if you're endorsing any kind of argument like the marginal cases argument, is probably in violation of the hate speech policy. Anyway, I can't talk about this in as much detail as I would like. I'm limited in what I can say. If you have a problem with that, you should petition YouTube to make its hate speech policy a little less broad, so that we can have these philosophical arguments without risking the channels being shut down. Okay, let's start with infants. Why do infants matter? Well, first, rational minds do not just pop into the world fully formed. Rationality is a product of a gradual developmental process, a process which starts with the newborn baby. Human infants will in fact become moral agents in the right kind of environment. Now I want to make it clear, for me, the issue is not so much that infants are potentially rational. Rather, the reason they count morally is that they actually have the capacities to develop rational agency. There is a radical difference between human infants and animals in this respect. We cannot raise an animal to become a member of the core moral community, no matter how much effort we expend. An infant will, over time, develop the kind of rationality that is required for membership in the core moral community. An animal cannot do this, and this must be because of differences in their brain structure. So, we know that there must be a significant difference between the capacities, between the brain structures of infants and animals, even if infants do not yet display it in their behaviour. It's not as if infants are the same as pigs for, say, the first year of life, and then some magic happens and the baby's brain is radically altered, or like a soul gets installed or whatever. No, the differences are there from the start, and these differences support the development of rationality in the human. I think it's a relevant fact about humans that rationality is a product of gradual development. Infants are simply at an early point in that development, and infants will immediately step on the path to rationality. They immediately begin learning. Again, it's not as though there are a few months where the infant's brain is inactive or anything like that. From the moment of birth, its brain will start to change in response to its environment. It will learn, it will respond to social cues, it starts figuring things out. Of course, animals do similar things. Animals learn, they have similar abilities, but these are not a stage in a developmental path to rationality of the right kind. And I suppose we might express this in simple terms by saying that the infant is potentially rational. Potential rationality is all that's required. I don't think that quite gets to the heart of it, though, because it's not so much in virtue of merely potential properties. It's not in virtue of properties that the infant could one day have but does not now have that we grant it moral status. It's in virtue of its actual properties, that it actually has structures in its brain that support the development of rationality. So this is the first point. Second point, and these points are both connected. The second point is that rational agents negotiate on rules that protect them from the depredations of others, promote cooperation, and improve social stability. I want rules that, if followed by all, would tend to make me better off, and others want the same for themselves. Now, it's quite easy to see that denying infants moral standing would tend to make people worse off, and this is because of essentially the point I previously made, which is that rationality is a gradual process. It's a developmental process. Infants will grow into rational agents, and the things that you do to infants will have a significant effect on the persons they will become. If I abuse an infant, it grows into a person, it may suffer from physical or psychological damage, which will make that person more dependent on others, or make that person less intelligent, make them worse at making decisions, more impulsive, more violent. These are the terrible consequences of abuse. And that's bad for the rest of us. We want a society of strong, healthy, intelligent, productive people. That's the ideal, because that benefits pretty much everybody. Producing that society means treating people well from the start. And notice you can agree to this point even if you don't care about infants for their own sake, because it's in your self-interest to improve society as a whole. So it's the same as with other moral rules. I don't have to care about you or your possessions, but I recognise that it's to my benefit for everybody to follow certain property conventions, as opposed to might makes right. On the other hand, there is no particular reason why we should have concern for animals. Indeed, concern for animals will tend to interfere with our ability to improve human society, insofar as it will impose limits on experiments that we might do, on exploitation of potential resources. So concern for infants benefits the core moral community. Concern for animals makes it worse off. Now, there are certain practices with animals that are bad for humans. As I will suggest, I think the meat industry is appallingly bad for human well-being. But there's no general argument for animal moral standing here. The problems with those practices are because of their effect on humans, not because of their effect on animals. But yeah, I mean, I think that, as I say, granting infants moral standing is partly because of the way in which rationality is this developmental process. They are at the start of that developmental process, and because they become persons, they become members of this community, and we're all better off treating them well. Another point that's worth mentioning here, which I first saw made by Peter Carruthers in his book The Animals Issue. I've said that morality arises from the construction of rules for promoting cooperative behaviour. And if that's the point of morality, we do need to have some concern for human psychology here. We need to consider what set of rules would actually be conducive to such behaviour. And Carruthers says that one reason for granting rights or granting standing to infants is that failing to do so would likely destabilise society. If anything is a human universal, it seems that concern for infants would be it. Many people care more about their children than they do about themselves, and almost everybody sees children as being worthy of special protection. And what's more, there appear to be pretty strong evolutionary reasons for this. I don't really want to get into evolutionary psychology. I'm appropriately skeptical of that field. But this is, I mean, really just a matter of, I guess, kin selection plus the fact that humans are extreme K strategists. Humans have relatively few offspring and they always require extensive periods of care. So naturally there's going to be pretty strong selective pressure towards caring for infants and for valuing communities of people in which everybody generally recognises infants as needing protection. And so notice that this attachment to infants is, in a sense, sort of pre-moral. People don't generally arrive at their concern for infants via any kind of moral reasoning. In the same way as they don't arrive at concern for their own welfare via moral reasoning. It's just a very deep emotional disposition. And much as it is important to subject our emotional dispositions to critique, and emotional dispositions can be changed, this looks like one that it would be extraordinarily difficult to change. So when negotiating appropriate rules, we do need to consider general facts about human motivation. We don't want to implement rules that would be utterly in conflict with deep parts of human psychology, deep and most likely unchangeable parts of human psychology. If we did not grant infants moral standing, well, their status would be that of mere property. Why not take them to perform medical experiments or to harvest their organs or whatever? We can argue about whether it's acceptable to expropriate property for the overall welfare of society, but very few people would accept this with infants. Any attempt to institute such rules would likely lead to violent revolution. There would be significant social instability if we started treating infants as mere property. People would not accept that. Obviously that's not the case with animals. There have been plenty of societies in which people have had almost no concern for animal welfare. Indeed, the degree of concern that we have for animals seems to be fairly unique to our society and to a few religious doctrines like Jainism. The modern West is quite unusual in its degree of concern for animal suffering. And even today, even with our exaggerated sympathy for animals, this doesn't produce any real social instability in response to animal suffering. Outside of there's a few small terrorist cells that even many animal liberationists view as extremists. So there's not the same potential for social instability there. Of course, there have been societies in which infants have been valued less than in ours, even societies that have practiced infanticide. But this is usually due to poverty or other poor environmental circumstances. These communities lived in such a precarious state that they had to be selective about who received the available resources. Indeed, notice that we may agree to rules under which rational agents could be expelled from communities or even killed if the resources were scarce. Think of people on a boat, lost at sea. They know that their food is running low. They may all agree on the rule that if they run out of food, they will kill and eat whoever is weakest. Or perhaps they will draw straws and kill whoever gets the shortest straw. In this desperate situation, you're willing to kill even another rational agent. In the same kind of way, yes, there are societies that have placed less value on infants, but that's because they were living precariously and just, they didn't have the resources to support all of the people being born. So that's what Carruthers has to say, or at least that's one of the things Carruthers has to say about the marginal cases argument. I should point out, I'm not sure I agree with Carruthers here. I think the case for moral standing of infants rests on the 2 points about how rationality is a developmental process. Nevertheless, his point about the need to construct rules compatible with human psychology is important, and it does, I think, dovetail quite nicely with my account, so I mention it here for that reason. Okay then, so that covers infants, why infants have moral standing. What about the other types of marginal humans? Well, I'll be a bit more brief here. Okay, first take people who become senile due to diseases such as Alzheimer's. I think this one is straightforward. So I might become mentally incapacitated myself, and if that were to happen, I would want people to observe certain constraints with respect to me. Basically, everybody else feels the same way. So we all agree. We all agree. Okay, yeah. If any of us like lose our rational capacities, we will continue to treat you with as having moral standing. I mean, it is true that some people will say things like, "Oh, if I ever slip into a coma, pull the plug," and that maybe indicates, you might think, that they wouldn't take themselves to have moral standing. But actually, when people say things like this, they're really affirming that they want to be respected in that situation. They do not want things imposed upon them to which they do not currently consent. In particular, they do not want, to have life-saving medical equipment imposed upon them without their consent. From their point of view, pulling the plug is the humane thing to do. So, we're all at risk of losing our rational capacities, and if that were to happen, we all want to be treated well. So, the general assumption then is, once you have moral standing, you don't lose it. Indeed, notice there's a sense in which suspension of rational capacities happens regularly. When I go to sleep, my rational capacities blink out. Obviously, I wouldn't want somebody to kill me in my sleep. Again, this is maybe connected to the point that rationality is a product of biological development. It's a somewhat fragile state. It blinks on and off. Sometimes, sadly, it blinks off forever. But those entities that have moral standing in virtue of this just have it permanently. Okay, next there are humans born with severe mental disabilities, humans who are not rational and never will become rational. Well, one reason to extend standing to these humans is it turns out many of them actually do develop rational faculties. There are sometimes quite surprising cases here. If you Google the man without a brain, you can find the case of a French guy who had extreme hydrocephalus, which is a build-up of fluid in the brain which destroyed almost the entirety of the internal part of his brain and left him with a thin layer of brain tissue around the skull. Yet he was healthy and lived a relatively normal life. This kind of thing might be rare, but it should make us very cautious about pronouncing that certain people are beyond all help. Brains can be quite remarkable. So, if somebody is born with a brain like that, you might say, okay, it's hopeless. They've just, there's nothing there. It's just a thin layer around the skull. Actually, turns out that can support a relatively normal life. For this kind of reason, we should err on the side of caution. You don't want to be killing people that actually do count. And it can sometimes be very unclear, even in cases that seem hopeless. Sometimes you get lucky. In general, when people are born with cognitive disabilities, we treat this as a problem to be solved. Ideally, we would like to bring them into the same condition as the rest of us, and occasionally we're successful. New technologies might be developed, new methods might be found for interacting with these humans, and we might be able to apply these things to help them develop rational capacities. This kind of attitude would make no sense at all with animals. A dog that will never learn language is not cognitively disabled, and we certainly don't try to fix its disability. Okay, so that's the marginal cases argument, and that's the case against animal moral standing. So let's turn to veganism more generally. I think there's a pretty good case for going vegan. Why? Well, for some of you, and I'm only addressing some of you here, the reason why you should go vegan is that you don't actually endorse my position. You do care about animal welfare. You support laws restricting how people may treat their pets. You support laws preventing things like declawing cats. You're horrified by the use of animals in cosmetic testing. You support the campaigns to end practices such as fox hunting and bullfighting. You're shocked to discover barbaric cultures in which people eat dogs. And just to be clear, okay, if there's anybody listening to this who eats meat, if you participate in that industry while feeling that it's terribly wrong to eat dogs, I mean, you just need to shut the fuck up. You are more annoying than the world's most annoying vegan. And as far as I'm concerned, you should be frozen out of discourse about this topic. So please fuck off. That's just for the people who think there's something bad about eating dogs while they eat meat. Those of you who eat meat while objecting to bullfighting, that's still annoying, but not quite as annoying. But let's talk about that. Let's take these other cases like bullfighting. So the usual line here is going to be something like this: animals in the meat industry are killed. They're just killed for their meat, right? Like the killing is perhaps unfortunate, right? But like, hey, we want something from them. We want the meat. We kill them, and that's that. Whereas bullfighting imposes a lot of suffering on the animal. So the idea, I suppose, is killing is okay, suffering isn't. The obvious problem with this is that animals in the meat industry often do not have quick deaths. That might well be the ideal, and obviously different countries have different laws here. Animal welfare legislation is, I think, quite a lot stricter in the UK than it is in the US. But look, especially in factory farms, animals are subjected to a great deal of suffering in ways that have been adequately detailed in many other places. And in any case, even assuming that food animals all die quickly and painlessly, and they don't, but even assuming that they all did, what about their lives overall? Well, it seems to me that by almost any measure, the overall quality, the overall life of a fighting bull is significantly better than that of animals in factory farms. I mean, part of this is just because the bulls that are used in bullfighting need to look strong and perform well. You don't want some timid, weak, emaciated creature, because that's not entertaining. Similarly, you don't want some creature that has been bred to be like so fat that it can barely walk on its own legs, as many chickens have. So fighting bulls actually have pretty good lives. They're bred free range on large estates with varied grazing spaces. During this time, they rarely come into contact with humans. They must be at least 4 years old before entering the ring, although by 3 years they can be used for training bullfighters. But they have not exactly long lives, but they've got a reasonable chunk of life there. So compare this to animals in agriculture. Even their best life, even in the best case, their lives are generally short, dull, in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. I think there's a very good case that fighting bulls have better lives. And what's more, consider that in a bullfight, you'll have a few animals being used to entertain thousands of people in one major event. I find it very hard to see how that's worse than the deaths of hundreds of animals, potentially hundreds of animals, used to feed one single person over the course of a year. That's putting aside the fact that animals in factory farms are frequently abused in ways that are actually against the law. I mean, they do what they can to cut corners at the expense of animal welfare. So yeah, I mean, if you are among the many people in the West who object to bullfighting, you should go vegan. Obviously. Okay then. So that covers actually most of you. Most of you think that my position is monstrous, and if you think that, you should go vegan. Okay then, what about the rest of you, those who do share my moral perspective? If we think that animals don't matter, what's wrong with consuming animal products? Well, animal agriculture is bad for humans because it is a major contributor to environmental degradation. I'm not going to go through this in detail here. If you're interested in the empirical details, you can look it up. Again, this is something that's been adequately detailed in many, many other places. But animal agriculture is one of the primary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. It uses about 80% of agricultural land. It's a driver of pollution, deforestation, soil erosion, biodiversity loss. The pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and feed additives that are used in growing crops for livestock, they pollute the waterways. It's a major source of water consumption. It accounts for between 20 to 30% of freshwater use in the world, far more than would be required if we all had a vegan diet. In the United States, it takes about 2,400 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef, compared to 25 gallons to produce a pound of wheat. Obviously, the exact numbers differ elsewhere, but by any measure, animal agriculture is sucking the earth dry. On top of this, animal agriculture encourages the spread of infectious disease, particularly intensive farming practices, where, again, you have overcrowding of animals in unsanitary conditions, and then interacting with humans. That breeds disease. These diseases sometimes spread to humans. Furthermore, in many places, animals are pumped with antibiotics as a preventative measure. Over 70% of the world's antibiotics are used in animal agriculture, which promotes antimicrobial resistance. So the destruction of the environment is something that we should be taking seriously, because it undermines the conditions that make stable civilization possible. And there is a general consensus that animal agriculture is one of the leading contributors to almost every significant environmental problem. Okay, with all of that in mind, it is tempting to give an argument like this. It's tempting to give an argument along these lines. We ought not to support food production practices that destroy the environment when there are available alternative food sources that are more environmentally friendly. Animal agriculture is destroying the environment. There are available alternative food sources that are more environmentally friendly, so we ought not to support animal agriculture. That's a tempting argument. There are a couple of problems with it, though. So, first of all, premise 2 and 3 here, so this claim that animal agriculture is destroying the environment and there are alternative sources that are more environmentally friendly, that's slightly misleading. It's misleading to say that animal agriculture specifically is destroying the environment. I mean, it certainly is destroying the environment, but the real problem is not exactly animal agriculture specifically, but industrial agriculture in general. Now, yes, industrial animal agriculture is particularly bad, but as long as we have industrial, mass-scale, non-local agriculture, even if we were to go entirely plant-based, that's still going to have serious environmental consequences. Environmental problems are a product of the general way in which food is now produced in a mass-scale, non-local way. Vegans participate in this. Indeed, in some places, vegans must participate in this, because these industrial practices are, in some places, required in order for veganism to provide a nutritionally adequate diet. So, yes, in the modern world, you can get adequate nutrition with a vegan diet, but that requires, in at least some places, mass-scale, non-local agriculture. There are locations where the only way to have an environmentally sustainable, nutritionally adequate diet involves meat consumption. And this, of course, is just to say there have been plenty of societies in which consumption of animal products occurs in sustainable ways. And if we move towards more sustainable forms of agriculture, the integration of animals may be important. On permaculture farms, for instance, animals play a crucial role in maintaining the ecosystem, while hunting of animals such as deer can help to ensure that their populations remain at reasonable levels. In many places in the United States, humans have driven out other predators of deer, like cougars, wolves, bears, and bobcats. That's led to explosions in deer populations, which have destructive effects on the environment. And you got to hunt them to keep their populations in check. Well, I suppose you don't have to hunt them, but that's one thing you could do. And obviously, hunting itself and eating the meat that is acquired from hunting is a activity that many people enjoy, would motivate them to go out and do that. So, even today, a careful meat eater can quite easily, well, maybe not easily, but can have a more environmentally friendly diet than a careless vegan. What's more, not only do vegans participate in destructive agricultural practices, they also participate in the meat industry. When you purchase food at a supermarket or a restaurant, they will use some of that money to restock their products, including a range of animal products. So unless you have largely abandoned modern society, your food purchases will fairly directly fund the meat industry. There's a fairly clear sense in which most vegans actually do support the meat industry, and then so they don't in fact engage in a alternative means of food acquisition. A person who scavenges or steals their food, including meat, and so who acts in resistance to the economic system as it is currently structured, I would say is far less complicit in the meat industry than a vegan who purchases food from standard sources. Having said all of this, the vegans do have a point. On average, given our current food production system, vegan diets are less environmentally damaging than diets involving animal products. I suppose the way to put it is this. If we're going to do industrial agriculture, then it's better that it be vegan, assuming we keep all the other factors like human population level fixed, and assuming we bear in mind that there are certain vegan products that can also be very environmentally damaging, and so we avoid them. But the simple fact is that if everybody went vegan, things would be better off. And in general, people need simple moral rules. This is an important point with respect to constructing moral rules. They can't be too complex if we want people to succeed in following them, because most people just don't have time to do moral philosophy or to consider the intricacies of applied ethics. Most people will not be willing to research every product they buy. Most people will not take the effort to acquire all of their food from sustainable sources. Most people will not steal or scavenge their meat. Most people will not raise any serious challenge to modern capitalism or to industrial agriculture in particular, as long as it continues to meet their basic needs. With this in mind, go vegan is good advice. It's a simple heuristic which I think quite obviously obscures many complexities, but people need simple heuristics. If everybody went vegan, the environment would be better off, ever so slightly. Okay, so that's fair enough, but here's the second problem with the environmental argument. And this has to do with premise 1. Recall that premise 1 was the premise that we ought not to support food production practices that destroy the environment when there are alternative environmentally friendly sources available. The problem is that any kind of appeal to environmental sustainability, at best, only gets us to the conclusion that each of us ought to minimise our environmental impact. We can't say that each person has to do everything they can to reduce their environmental impact, because doing everything you could would involve just killing yourself, right? That would reduce your environmental impact to pretty much zero, but that would be absurd to require people to do that. So, what we say instead is, look, we ought to take reasonable steps towards reducing our environmental footprint. But there are a host of different ways of doing that, because there are so many things each of us do, so many institutions each of us participate in that contribute to environmental degradation. In my case, I have never and will never reproduce. And in refusing ever to have children, my environmental footprint is, I believe, much smaller than that of an environmentally conscious vegan who does reproduce. So, I think the meat eater, or indeed the vegetarian, can quite reasonably ask why there would be any obligation to give up animal products. After all of us will participate in institutions that have negative effects on the environment. All of us can do various things to reduce our environmental footprint. None of us can reduce it to zero, as long as we want to continue living in this society. So, okay, we all should do something, but we can't specify any particular thing. Eliminating animal products is one option, but there are many other options too. So, I think the answer to this is fairly straightforward, actually. Consumption of animal products is not really all that important to most people. Yes, there are some people who need to do it for health reasons. A vegan diet is certainly not appropriate for everybody. But for many people, if you really reflect on it, why do you consume animal products? Well, I think again, for many people, and I could be wrong here. I haven't done any empirical research on this, so I'm kind of speculating. But my guess is there are two main reasons. It's partly because it's what you've always done. It's what you're familiar with. It's habit. And people tend to just stick with what they've always done. And the second reason is that animal products taste nice. That's pretty much it. So, with respect to the first point, that it's what people have always done, well, if we're agreeing that we need to take certain steps to reduce our environmental footprint, then we're asking what things we can change, right? We're going to have to make changes, and we're asking what things we can change. So the fact that eating animal products is what we've always done is just irrelevant. As for taste, well, there are presumably plenty of other things that taste nice as well. I mean, really think about this. How much worse off would your life be if you couldn't consume animal products? What if you developed some sort of medical condition and the cure was to go vegan? How bad would that really be? I mean, I find it hard to believe that most people could honestly claim that would be a serious loss. And, compare this to other changes that you could make. Would you rather give up animals, give up consuming animal products, or give up having children? Would you rather give up consuming animal products or give up your car? Much better, by the way, to give up consuming animal products than give up your car. Giving up the animal products will have a larger effect. Anyway, the fact is that animal agriculture provides us with very few benefits while imposing huge environmental costs. So if we care about the environment, and obviously we should, then we need to make compromises. Animal products are the obvious thing to give up. Of course, this won't be enough, right? Building a sustainable society will require us to radically change how we produce food. But look, doing away with animal products will make a minor positive difference, and for many of us, there isn't really that much of a cost. In fact, it's perhaps going to be something that might benefit you. It's an opportunity to explore something new that you haven't done before. Change your diet. Use that as an adventure. So there's the basic case. There's the basic case for veganism. It's not a very strong case, I admit that. And I struggle to see good grounds, really, for blaming anybody who refuses to change. The reason why I struggle to blame anybody is, look, unless we radically alter our society, the whole environmental protection thing is a lost cause anyway. Everybody going vegan would not bring us close to solving the problem. Like, even if everybody went vegan, we wouldn't be close to solving the problem. This is, given how desperate the situation is, I think it's quite reasonable for people to say, look, we're just fucked anyway, right? Why shouldn't I just enjoy myself with the time I've got left? Like, this shit's over, Modern civilization is, as we know it, right, is going down. I might as well just enjoy myself. Consider the scenario in which nobody respects any property conventions. Everybody just steals from everybody else on a sort of might makes right basis. In this world, I could make the point that we would all be better off if we decided to adopt property rules. And I can promote the rules for this reason. So, I will conclude that it's morally wrong to steal certain things. But if the rest of society doesn't listen to me, why should I change my behaviour? Why should I care about morality? Refusing to steal in this situation would be pointless self-sacrifice. I'd just be making myself worse off without any long-term payoff. And I kind of feel much the same way about the environment in the real world. We can point out changes that it would be in everybody's self-interest to enact, but until serious steps are made towards enacting those changes, and those steps would, I think, this is not something that these changes are not really things that can be made on a sort of individual consumer activity sort of level. We need to radically change the way that our society is structured. Until those changes come about, I can't really blame anybody who sticks with the status quo, who just chooses to enjoy the last decade or so of civilization as we know it. Everybody else is enjoying themselves. Why shouldn't I? Well, I don't have an answer to that. So, there you go. That's it. Okay, the final point I want to discuss is why exactly animal welfare is increasingly high on the agenda for people these days. This is obviously going to be rather speculative, and this is not really an argument against animal liberation, but I do think that uncovering the sources of sentimentalism towards animals might help put animal liberation in a slightly different light. Again, Peter Carruthers has written a little on this point. So, defenders of animal liberation often have a picture of history on which their view is a clear example of moral progress. When we look across the last few hundred years, we see an expansion of rights, an expansion of the entities that were granted moral considerability, or indeed the humans that were granted moral considerability. First of all, class distinctions are challenged. Whereas once certain privileges, like the right to vote, were held only by men of a particular class, we then came to see this as morally irrelevant. The same rights were extended to all men. Then gender discrimination was challenged. Yes, there are differences between men and women, but none of those are morally relevant differences, at least with respect to political rights. Then racial discrimination is challenged, and equal moral status is granted to all the races. The result is that all citizens have the same basic rights, there's this basic principle of equality. And this kind of process is captured in Peter Singer's metaphor of the expanding circle. Over time, humans have gradually expanded the circle of people that they take as being worthy of equal consideration, starting with the tribe, ending with all of humanity. The extension of moral standing to animals, to all sentient creatures, is then pictured as just the next step on the road of moral progress. We now see that there is no morally relevant difference between animals and at least some humans, so animals should be accorded the same basic rights that we grant to humans. Animal liberation is the result of reason triumphing over speciesist prejudice. Just as we reject sexism and racism and other prejudice, so we will soon see the lack of concern for animals as speciesism. Just another unjustified prejudice. Well, I've already explained why I think there is a significant difference between animals and infants. So I want to make some tentative suggestions about what is really driving the explosion of support behind animal liberation. Now, just to be clear, I'm quite sure that many defenders of animal liberation have arrived at their view in reasonable ways. Indeed, in my own experience, ethical vegans tend to be much more thoughtful and more critical than meat eaters, but I also want to resist the idea that those who reject animal liberation are just, obstinate reactionaries who will pick whatever ad hoc argument will get them to the conclusion that animals have no moral standing. So, with that said, here are some other factors that may be driving the animal liberation movement. First of all, there's a great deal of anthropomorphism of animals in children's entertainment. Media that's directed at children is absolutely saturated with animal characters that have the attributes of persons. Animals are presented as moral agents everywhere you turn, right? Children watch animals on TV, they have animals in books, animal toys. These will either show animals, being cute and vulnerable, which encourages feelings of sympathy towards animals, or the animals will be presented as basically rational persons, which shows the animals as potential cooperators in the construction of moral rules. At the same time as this, as society has become increasingly separated from nature, children have very little interaction with real animals. Many children will have no direct experience of animals being used as resources, because very few people grow up on farms these days. They will not see animals as potential threats to their livelihoods. They will not have to deal with pest animals. And when children do visit things like farms and zoos, they just go to see the animals for their own sake. It's just entertainment. So again, these places will just tend to encourage, feelings of sympathy for animals. The one area where people do regularly interact with animals is their pets. From birth, many people are raised in homes where animals are companions, essentially treated as honorary family members, and so as honorary members of the moral community. Again, this encourages children to treat animals as being just like us. So, overall, what do children see? In their homes, animals are companions. In media, animals are presented as persons, and there's no interaction with other types of animals, right? The way that the way that many children are brought up is just essentially animals are beings like us, and that's how they're encouraged to view them. On top of all of this, arguably one of the negative consequences of our modern economic system is increasing personal isolation and breakdown of more traditional community ties. As a result, many people are being driven to develop closer relationships with companion animals, because animals offer stable relationships. Your pets will never question you, never leave you. There's no difficulty maintaining a relationship with them. For people who struggle to find adequate social interaction, either due to the economic circumstances or the structure of their community or mental health problems or whatever, naturally are going to look to companion animals for comfort. So animals, again, gain a place as important as humans in our emotional lives. I suspect that all of these factors, and maybe more, are encouraging an inappropriate extension of sympathy to animals. And I do not see them as particularly progressive. Indeed, I suspect that if we were to shift towards a more sustainable society with less emphasis on material consumption, if we were to challenge capitalism and try to build non-hierarchical social structures with stronger communities, if we were to build the kind of societies that anarchists favour, I think that would considerably dampen sentimentality towards animals. So I don't see animal liberation or increased sentimentality towards animals as evincing any kind of process, nor do I think that my own views are reactionary. On the contrary, when I look at previous civil rights movements, I see a recognition of common humanity, a move towards realising the full potential for human progress. Insofar as sentimentality towards animals has the effect of restricting human behaviour and of blocking activities that may be of benefit to humans, I think it is morally repugnant. Okay, that's it. That's my views on animals and veganism. You people asked, so that's what you got. Goodbye.